πάρα πολύ τον κύριο Γραβάνη, τον κύριο Ραγκούση, τον κύριο Αρσταβάνη Τσάκωνα και τον κύριο Κοντοζαμάνη για την πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα συζήτηση. Υπόσχεση, ναι, στο επόμενο του χρόνου πάλι το ίδιο θέμα συζήτησης. Και προχωράμε. Έχουμε τη χαρά να έχουμε μαζί μας τον κύριο Στέλιο Παπαδόπουλο, ο Chairman of the Board of the Biogen, σε μια συζήτηση με τον κύριο Αλέξη Παπαχελά. Καλώς ήρθατε, κύριο Παπαχελά. Έχουμε τον κύριο Παπαδόπουλο online. Κύριε Παπαχελά, έχετε εσείς το λόγο. Εντάξει, ευχαριστώ.
Αν μ' ακούτε.
Yes, I do.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for being with us. And let me ask you how you got to where you are. 30 years ago, you jumped on a plane with $200, I understand, and you didn't need the food because you thought you would have to pay for it, right? So we want to hear your story, how you ended up where you are today.
Well, it was really 55 years ago, not 30. I'm a lot older than maybe I appear. Look, it was very simple. I grew up in Thessaloniki. You've heard about it. By the way, I do apologize. I'm not speaking in Greek. I do speak Greek, but once it comes to professional matters, it gets very difficult for me to be as articulate as I would like to be. But I had started at Metsovio in electrical engineering. I wasn't sure I wanted to be an engineer. I was, through social pressure, forced to choose to go there. I wanted to be a great basic scientist. I found a little scholarship and I got on a plane. Actually, I first got on a train from Thessaloniki to Paris. It was cheaper to train first and then plane. And then in January 1967, I landed in New York, and as they said, the rest is history.
Let me ask you, you've been in this field for a long time. I mean, people call you the institutional memory of this specific field in the US. Tell us how much it has changed, how much more easier or more difficult it is to invest in this field and to attract talent and so on.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say I've been involved since the very beginning with this field. It was maybe the luckiest day of my life when I decided to get involved with biotechnology, not even appreciating at the time how enormously beneficial, how great this field will turn out to be and how huge it would turn out to be. I would say for, the late 70s when this all started and through the 80s, much of what we were doing was rather naive, simple, and focused in essentially one fundamental technology, which was production of human proteins through recombinant means using microbial systems. It was just essentially an alternative way of making human proteins. And to give you an example, human proteins at the time as pharmaceuticals were, for instance, insulin, that still is. At the time, up until that time of biotechnology, insulin was extracted from the pancreas of animals, primarily pigs and cows to some extent. Human growth hormone was being used for dwarfism. That was extracted from the cadaver, which is a small gland in the base of the brain of cadavers of dead people, and purified, isolated, and sold. So the access to human proteins as pharmaceuticals was very limited by the sources from which they could be extracted. So biotechnology came to solve that problem. And then it evolved. And probably the next big evolution in the 90s was a broadening of the technological base of the industry and the advent of antibodies. These are special proteins that recognize specifically tissues, organs, and cells, and antibodies as drugs. And of course, the antibodies as drugs has really exploded. And going forward, again, the broadening of technologies and all of that will take hours for me to go through. But the bottom line is where we are today, we've gotten into a place where the industry is extremely competitive, extremely innovation intensive, and extremely capital intensive. Nowadays, in the US, the good companies start out of the major university labs, MIT, Harvard, Yale, University of California, Johns Hopkins. And more often than not, the initial round of financing to get a company off the ground is, let's say, about $100 million. And that money is meant to last maybe for a year or two, maybe three, and then they'll raise more money and more money. By the time they're ready to launch a product, if they ever get that far, they would have spent several $billion of risk capital. So this is an industry now that operates at a very high level of capital intensity and innovation intensity. That was not the case in the 80s for sure. I mean, the scale is, 10 to 100 times bigger now than it used to be back in those days.
One thing I want to ask is, which always fascinates me in your field, is the element of risk, the element of failure. And I know you're familiar with this because you can't be where you are, without going through that. So how accepted is this? I mean, how many projects fail out of, 10 or 20 projects that, you have, in development?
Well, I think I'm a great fan of data, and by data I mean really accurate, insightful data, not the stuff you see in consulting reports here and there. And I can assure you that it's extremely difficult to answer that question specifically because you have to really define everything carefully. What do we mean by project? What is a project? A project. But I'm not going to bore you with the details of that. The answer is the vast majority fail. Now, whether it's 80% or 90% or 70%, more often than not, you're meant to start something, and in the back of your mind, it might fail, and then it fails. So you need to be comfortable with failure, and that's probably, perhaps the greatest competitive advantage of the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Failure in the US, more often than not, is considered the base for a lesson learned so it can be better, more efficient, more likely to be successful the next time around. And it's just like as an aside, the fundamental sports game in the US, that is what they call the American sport, is baseball. And in baseball, typically, the guy who goes to bat to hit the ball will fail about 70% of the time. If he wins 30% of the time by hitting the ball safely, he's good. If he wins 32% of the time, he's great. 35% of the time, it never happens. So Americans are quite familiar with failure and don't see it as a stain in your record and an indication you cannot succeed going forward.
I also want to ask you about regulation. Has it become more of a problem? Is it more complex? Is it more rigid than it used to be?
Yes, and I think for good reason. I think the Food and Drug Administration has a mandate, which is to protect the health of the nation and then enhance the health of the nation. And they've been extremely diligent over time in analyzing clinical trial data. For sure, the clinical trial scrutiny that is going on today is greater than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. And I think for good reason. I think there's a very good record of the regulatory authorities in the US of stopping projects that contain an undue amount of risk from reaching the market. And I think to their credit, particularly as of late in the last 10, 15 years, they're showing a willingness to bend the rules, to be flexible in allowing drugs without the full set of data to reach the market if they're scientifically promising and they are meant to address an unmet medical need. Specifically, what I'm addressing to is the concept of so-called accelerated approval, which has been widely used in the space of cancer. And what the regulatory bodies do in that instance is if they see some reliable biomarkers, some indicators that the drug is properly addressing the disease without necessarily proving that they extend life, for instance, or prevent death, they will approve the drug with the expectation the company will carry out an additional clinical trial or two to confirm that there is, in fact, a positive impact on survival. As of late, and in the news, it's been widely reported, Biogen has been the recipient, company I'm affiliated with, has been the recipient of that approach to accelerated approval in the area of neuroscience. That the FDA approved an Alzheimer's drug more than a year ago on the basis of removal of amyloid plaque that the FDA considered to be indicative of disease state. Now, the whole academic community is not in agreement with that, but we have another test case right now. There's yet another drug, the data of which was released last week, called lecanemab, again by Biogen in conjunction with a Japanese company, Eisai, and that has filed for accelerated approval again. And we'll see in January to what extent the FDA is prepared to grant accelerated approval or wait later on to give full approval. So yes, the regulatory structures have become more rigid, but at the same time, more accommodating and more attuned to problem solving and dealing with unmet medical needs than ever before.
And would you say that after COVID, we're at a different plateau, that COVID has really changed the industry for good? In what way?
COVID has changed the way we do everything. So I think the most fundamental change we've seen throughout the world is the notion that we can, in fact, be productive without necessarily having to be in the same place all the time. And I want to stress the all the time part. For instance, I am on Zoom today in this meeting. I'm hoping I will add something that would be positive. Spiros Artavanis was on Zoom. 3 years ago, it would have been highly unlikely that we'd have a hybrid conference with some people at the ground at the side of the conference and some people on video. We've obviously minimized travel on our end without necessarily losing efficiency. I'm now that we've resumed some part of travel, I'm meeting for the first time people after 2 or 3 years, and I'm not sure whether I've ever met them before face to face or we've only met on Zoom, which goes to tell you that the Zoom interaction is quite real. Something is lost in not being around. There's the informal part of the exchange that is often the source of great ideas. And I think the hybrid way of doing things might be the way to go. There's absolutely no way we're going to go back and do business. And by business, I mean pursue all facets of the pharmaceutical industry the way we used to before. People, there's the social component. You hear the world nowadays, work-life balance. And there would be a lot of people who, as they moved away from the major urban centers to more remote places in states like Montana or Tennessee or Arkansas, for whatever reason, they may not want to go back to LA or San Francisco or New York or Boston. We're going to have to deal with this because that's going to be a reality. And I think the last and very significant aspect of how we're going to do things is how do pharmaceutical companies interact with physicians? Historically, the model has been somewhat archaic. You know, the pharmaceutical representative goes to the doctor's office, sits in the waiting room for an hour, and waits for a 20-second glimpse. And I'm not exaggerating when I said 20-second glimpse with a physician to really get him to listen a word or two about what the drug is. He's giving him, as we call it, detail about, sign the iPad and confirm it, and then off they go. That's, as you can appreciate, highly inefficient. Now, can we replace this time-consuming, inefficient process with a virtual interaction that would be certainly as effective in communicating the message, but far more efficient and productive? To be determined. I think we all in the industry, we're all struggling with this, and that is going to be probably the biggest innovation. Once we solve that problem, will be the biggest innovation in the industry that would come out of COVID.
Now, given, as you said, that physical distance is not that important anymore, would it at some point be possible to create a similar culture of research and production here in Greece? I mean, already you have some things happening, and we're very optimistic about all those. But I wonder whether you can really have a critical mass which will also attract people like you and, of course, the younger generation of the brain drain back home.
Well, that's quite difficult. As Mr. Kotozamanis outlined, we spent the last 2 years working on a proposal to outline what could be done in Greece to make Greece part of the global innovative biopharma ecosystem. And you heard from Mr. Tavanis very explicitly from Mr. Gravanis, talking about what are the issues with innovation. From my end, look, innovation is a great word. Everybody loves innovation the same way we all love things like sustainable agriculture and renewable energy sources and organic vegetables. What is not to like about those things? So innovation is a nice, sexy term. But the fact is, for one thing, you cannot legislate innovation. All you can do as a government, as an entity, as even a business society, all you can do is put in place the ingredients that will contribute to creating an ecosystem that would lead to innovation. First and foremost, and I'm not going to repeat what Professor Tavani said before and Professor Gravanis, we need to create an academic research system that begins to look like the successful academic systems of countries where innovation takes place. Now, will we ever be the same as the United States? Absolutely not, simply from a scale point of view. Could we have a lab or two or three in Greece that they, competing with other labs in different countries, could be globally competitive? Of course, it's possible. What it takes is the recruitment of the right individuals, the right kind of funding, the right kind of leadership, all of which we know how to do and they're doable. But it's not just simply doing excellent research. The research that becomes the basis of innovative startups has to be clinically relevant, maybe not necessarily in a year or two or three. Even if it's 10 or 15 years, if it promises to redefine the way we deliver a therapy in a particular disease or to solve an unmet medical need, and if the scientific arguments are compelling as to why this approach deserves funding, it will happen. And frankly, the last thing that's important is the existence of, say, a venture industry in Greece. Capital is liquid. It's like water. It runs to find a place where it makes sense. So the moment there'd be great ideas in Greece or Bulgaria or Israel, the money will go there. That's not the problem. And then is the question of execution. Part of our project, our proposal was we need to reorganize the academic research system, universities and research institutes. Professor Tavanis has articulated this extremely well. I will not repeat what he said. And then theoretically, we have to wait around for 5 or 10 years for potentially maybe something of value to come out of there. But rather than simply waiting around for a miracle to happen, we propose that we can do a number of things. And Mr. Kotozamainis articulated a number of those ideas as they relate to biomanufacturing, clinical trials, and many other services, all of which I aim to do two things. One is create jobs and fuel the economy and be productive in their own right for the Greek economical environment, for the Greek economy. And the second is to produce and train a cadre of individuals, professionals, who, when the innovative ideas come out and new startups begin in Greece, they could become the leaders of those companies because they've been in an innovative sector in biopharma, for 5 or 10 years or more, and understand what needs to be done. So these are all the ideas that could theoretically take place. The key point is we need to understand what are the ingredients that will contribute ultimately to the creation of innovative companies and innovative products. And it isn't just the good science, we talked about this, or the good professionals. We need to have a broader environment that is conducive to innovation. We need to have legislation that makes it easier to do business. And there's been much progress in Greece over the last few years in making life easier for people to do business in Greece. Not enough. We need to reform the legislative system. You cannot take 15 years to adjudicate a business case. I mean, it's got to be done efficiently, fairly, and reliably. We need to enhance and improve the telecommunications grid. As people search for places to start a business in Greece, they got to make sure they can get, high-speed lines, reliable lines, the power grid. And even more broadly, the notion of how do we embrace innovation as a society. If I propose to a patient in the US that we enroll them in a clinical trial because existing medications are not capable of doing the right thing or doing enough for the patient. Patients feel privileged. They will have access potentially because many of the clinical studies are blinded and they're placebo controlled, but they'll have the hope that they may be part of an experimental next generation, potentially curative therapy. More often than not, in places like Greece, and Greece is not alone, you offer a patient the chance to be in a clinical trial, and the immediate thought is, they want to use me as an experimental animal. I don't want to be part of that. Last thing I would say is government needs to send a signal that they're embracing innovation. Mr. Agus has hinted to this already. Innovation means newer drugs. Newer drugs, by definition, by virtue of the cost of research and development, the many failures associated with research and development, the cost of production, are far more expensive than generic drugs of yesteryear. Just to give you an idea, in the United States, which has the highest per capita drug pharmaceutical budget in the world, 90% of the prescriptions for patients in the US are filled for generics. It is mandatory if there's a generic for the drug, unless the doctor specifically intervenes, no matter what the doctor says in the prescription, for the pharmacist to give the generic drug to the patient has no recourse. 10% is the newer drugs, and of course, they're quite expensive. Now, governments in Europe, and Greece again is not alone, need to understand that innovation costs money, but that's what it will take to get access for their patients to these newer drugs. We're running the risk in the next 10 years of Europe being priced out of the global innovative market because they will not agree to prices that would make it attractive for global pharmaceutical companies to launch drugs in Europe. And Greece is in that danger zone.
Are there other countries, and especially smaller countries, which are kind of role models in this field?
Models for drug pricing or innovation? Innovation. I think the classic example, everybody in Greece loves to use Israel as a comparator to Greece. Similar size, small country. The big difference, as I see it, is Israel is a company with a very extensive diaspora, far greater than the Greek diaspora, which somehow by happenstance happens to be prominent in the biopharma sector. And that diaspora contributes meaningfully to developments within Israel. Israel is a country that is continuously in a state of war and needs to address challenges and problems for which technology may be an interesting approach to defending the country. And many innovations in Israel, in the technology side primarily, have come out of defense-related research programs. The GDP of Israel is about twice that of Greece, so it's a wealthier country, but it's an example of what can be done. The other typical examples we use, Belgium, similar size. Belgium has a very long tradition in the pharmaceutical industry with many old pharma companies, an attractive environment until not long ago. Belgium was headquarters for European headquarters for most of the US-based pharmaceutical companies. So there's a lot of activity at the university level, at the small company level, at the large company level. And perhaps, obviously Switzerland is a great example. And in fact, a lot of the data on European spending in R&D is tilted by virtue of Switzerland, with the giants, with Hoffmann La Roche and Novartis being headquartered in Switzerland. But of course, even the bulk of the research they do is done outside of Switzerland. There's just not enough people, not enough resources in a small country to do that, but they're a unique exception. Lastly, the one I will mention, again, similar size to Greece, is Ireland. Ireland has become a major destination for manufacturing of biologicals, largely because some 30 years ago, they decided to focus on that space, and they've created the broader ecosystem of professionals, services, legislation, as well as originally a favorable tax environment. And I would stress the following. Whenever we speak of foreign investment in Greece, we immediately go to the word incentives. And immediately what we need to think about, or we think about, is, tax breaks, benefits, financial things that the government needs to part with to give these companies to come. That's not, it's a reason, it's a significant reason. It's not the major reason. The broader ecosystem is what attracts people to go in there. And Ireland is probably, per capita, for sure, the largest manufacturer of expensive, innovative biological drugs than any other country. They all offer lessons for us to learn from.
I wonder whether Greece keeps producing talent. Do the Greek universities keep producing people who get into your field and they excel? I mean, do you see that flow keeping going on? Or?
You always see it, and in some ways, what you see is what you would like to see. And I'm very sensitized to identifying Greek talent. I feel the affinity for other Greeks. So I see a lot of them in the US. And, you know, as has been reported, many of us get together, we know each other, and we recognize each other. Is that on a strict statistical basis too high, too low? I couldn't tell you. I can tell you this. I don't think the university education system in Greece is exemplary. And I wouldn't tell you that it cannot be meaningfully improved, you know, through appropriate means. But yes, there is talent in Greece. And typically when we see it is when it comes to the US and takes jobs in, you know, different institutions.
I take this as the understatement of the year, that it's not exemplary, the Greek university system, but anyway.
I'm trying to be diplomatic.
The last thing I want to ask you is, there's been a lot of excitement post-COVID, that there are a lot of new things, amazing innovation, you know, new drugs that will cure cancer and other things. Do you share this excitement, or is this sort of, you know, hype?
Let's put it this way. This industry has gone well beyond any of my expectations that I had back in the 1980s when I first became involved. And I'm continuously excited every day for new scientific foundings, new approaches to treating disease, new ideas and projects of developing drugs. So I am excited. I could not tell you that I see COVID all of a sudden has given us a step function in improving the ability of scientists to deal with disease. About the only thing I would identify as unique that has come out of COVID that is meaningful is the use of messenger RNA technology for the purpose of generating, as we all know, the well-known vaccines by Pfizer, BioNTech, and by Moderna. Now, there is an important question here, which is at this point unanswered. Will this mRNA technology be the basis for additional vaccines in infectious diseases? Will we have, let's say, a flu vaccine based on the mRNA technology? Likely. I think there's a good reason why that could happen. The next question is, will there be cancer vaccines based on this technology? That's a lot more difficult. And I'm not convinced myself right now that this will become a reality. But even if all we got out of COVID was the mRNA platform for infectious disease vaccines, that's an enormous accomplishment. And the other side observation is the speed with which the companies in the space and the regulatory authorities throughout the world moved to make the vaccines available to the people was absolutely remarkable, well beyond anyone's expectations, certainly mine. I didn't think we could produce a vaccine of this extraordinary efficacy in the amount of time we did. So congratulations to the companies and the regulatory authorities. And maybe the dark side, the dark page to all of this is the public's unwillingness to be vaccinated. I still try to figure out what it is about these vaccines, or vaccines in general, that has so many people resisting them. It's a crime committed against themselves and society. So, you know, I'll stop with that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. It was really great talking to you, and hope to see you in Greece soon. Thank you. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ.
Thank you very much.